A couple of administrative announcements. First of all, you should be able to see your midterm grades now in the system. So have a look at it.
Blackboard.
On Blackboard. Okay. The second thing is, so occasionally I'll be asking you for a bit of feedback in terms of the speed. So last Monday we slowed down a bit, went through things in a bit more detail. Okay. And I'd like to get a bit of a gauge of speed and detail. So assuming that 1 means a lot slower, 2 means slower, 3 means about right, 4 means I should be presenting stuff a little bit faster, 5 means I should be presenting stuff a lot faster. Okay, so who opts for 1, which means I should be going through stuff a lot more slowly? Who opts for 2? I should be going through things a little bit more slowly than Monday. Okay, 3 votes. Who opts for 3? Okay, so that's basically just about right. Who opts for I should be going through things a little bit faster? Okay, 2, right? That's 3. Okay, cool. Who opts for I should be going through things a lot faster? Okay. So those of you who want me to cover more things and go through things a little bit faster, you can come along to my lab meeting, and we'll be going through additional papers and additional stuff there. So if you want to know more stuff, basically talk to me about that, and this way you'll learn more. But it looks like we have at the moment a heavily peaked distribution at, hey, just keep it the way it is. So I'll do that until you tell me otherwise. Okay, so as said, I can do things more slowly or faster, but it depends on you, what works best for you. So tell me in the lecture, not in the forums. Thanks. Okay. Were there any questions from last week? Everything clear? Sorry, from Monday. Wow, okay. So let me just briefly recap what we did, what we finished up with on Monday. We basically introduced conjugate priors, and they're kind of really nice and special in the sense that the priors just look like the posteriors. And one way to achieve this is by adding fake data. And obviously, if I assume that the fake data and the real data were both drawn independently, identically from the same distribution, then I can just do one thing, namely I merge those two data sets. And then I go my merry ways and just perform estimation as if I had just observed more data, right? And we also saw that the updates in this case are very simple. Namely, you just get, let's see whether the pointer works. No, it doesn't. You basically just get the prior mean plus the empirical mean. And that now plays the same role as what we had in our maximum likelihood setting before. And the sample size is bumped up by M0. We went through a couple of cases of, what numbers of M0 you might want to use. Let's say if you gamble with me, rather if you gamble with somebody who you don't trust. Right? Of course, I'm assuming you trust me. So there will be, as you've probably seen, there's one problem in the assignments which deals with this. Yes? We'll get to that on the next 2-3 slides. So who has already worked with Laplace smoothing at some point? Okay. Who has worked with a bag of words model for documents? Okay. And probably you had at some point the problem with bag of words that you get counts of 0. And if you get counts of 0, you're screwed, right? Because as soon as you take logs of that, well, everything goes wrong. So most of us at some point had that problem, and then all you did is you just added 1 to the counts, and all the problems went away, right? Who's done this before? Okay. This is an example of a very simple conjugate prior that you just applied. So the conjugate prior was to say, well, you know, my prior assumption is that each word occurs with equal probability, and I'm giving it an equivalent count of 1 that I add to things. That's an example of such a conjugate prior. So you basically added fake data, and your fake data was a bag of words that contained each and every word exactly once. Now, who thinks this is a good idea? Yeah. It's a good idea if you're trying to smooth Klingon. In other words, if you're trying to smooth a language for which you have absolutely no clue what you're doing. If you're working with English and you have specific documents, then knowing that it's English, there's a good chance that you actually know what the baseline frequencies of occurrence for words are. Because you can just basically crawl the web or, you know, send a nice letter to Google and ask them to send you several, you know, Ngram DVDs, or Yahoo provides the same thing. And then you just use that as a baseline. So probably the word and or and so on occurs more frequently than the word heteroscedastic, right? So therefore, it's kind of stupid to smooth the word ands and or, the words and or, with the same smoother as heteroscedastic. Right? So you can use the baseline language model as a much better idea for a smoother than just adding 1 to all the counts. In other words, for heteroscedastic, you might add 10 to the minus 3, 10 to the minus 4 to it, and for and or, maybe you add a 3 or a 4. And this obviously gives you rather much better estimates. Okay. So, let's just look at what happens in practice. So, we have our fake observations. And so, of course, P of theta is proportional by base rule to P of x fake. And, well, this is how we designed it. So, therefore, P of theta given x is proportional to P of x given theta, that's our likelihood term, times P of the fake data given that parameter. And since I can just merge it, I can plug everything in. Right? You get proportionality. We went through why this is not an equality on Monday, because 1 is a likelihood and that is now not normalized in theta. So we need to integrate out over theta to make sure this actually becomes a proper probability distribution. Right? That's in the top line. Nonetheless, well, we can then actually go and, you know, optimize over theta. There's no reason why we shouldn't. Right? And so we just maximize that. So that will give us the maximum a posteriori estimate. For that, we don't need that normalization. Okay. So remember what we had for maximum likelihood. We have basically that the expectation. Okay, so let's just recap this. We had P of x parameterized by theta is the product I going from 1 to m P of xi parameterized by theta, which in the exponential families model is the product I going from 1 to m e to the phi of xi dot theta minus g of theta, right? Yeah, because everybody can sort of read that. And so if we want to maximize this with respect to theta, then what we can do is we can take the log and we maximize the log of it, right? Because in that case, this exponential becomes a sum. So therefore, minus log of P of x parameterized by theta. And let me actually divide it by m, just to make our life a bit easier, is 1 over m sum over I going from 1 to m, well, g of theta. That's because I just, you know, I have the minus here, so I need to swap things. And then I get minus 1 over m sum over I going from 1 m phi of xi dot theta. And of course, by linearity of the inner product, I can pull that out. And because the average of a constant function is a constant, I can get rid of this. Right? So that's the middle line here.
So is
Yep.
that n on top of the big sigma?
M equals n.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, thanks. Now, yeah, there's another type on the next line. So now what I'm going to do is I therefore get, you know, if I take the derivative of this, sometimes you write it as the log likelihood. This equals 1 over n minus the sum over I then from 1 m phi of xi minus, now d theta of g of theta is just the expected value minus the expectation of x drawn from p equals 0. In other words, the expectation needs to match our empirical average. Okay, that's what we had for maximum likelihood before. Now, if we have fake data, the only thing that changes is really this term here. Because before, we had just the average over empirical observations. And now this becomes 1 over m plus m0. m0 times mu0 plus sum over I going from 1 m phi of xi. So if you think about, you know, your Laplace smoothing for the language model, you added a count of 1 to each of the observations. So these were, you know, your xi's. You basically added fake data. And now you just need to renormalize such that everything adds up to 1. And so now you get this has to be equal to E x drawn from P of 5x. Now, difficult question, but I think you can figure it out from this. Are there any restrictions that I need to impose on mu0? Okay. Let's, for instance, take, you know, a, you know, just binary distribution. So I have outcomes 0 and 1, and phi of x is x. So this is the simplest case. What values may I assume for mu0? What's the range of values for mu0? Okay, any suggestions? Can somebody tell me a reasonable value? Let's just, you know, plot this, right? Of x, and well, here's 0, here's 1. This is phi of 0. This is phi of 1. So, on Monday we said, well, you know, mu0 equals 1/2 is maybe not such an unreasonable thing if you assume, if somebody tosses a coin, right? So that one was okay. And then we said, you know, if we play with some gambler who we don't really trust and we think he's going to cheat us, well, and he bets on heads, well, then we might actually assume that, you know, his coin will be more than likely to come up on heads. Are we allowed to pick something like mu0 equals 2? No. No. Why can't we do that? Hey, a little bit louder. I can pass around the microphone if you want, but okay. Yes, we are not allowed to do so, but why not?
It's out of the range of 5.
Exactly. It's outside the range of those phi's. So those phi's actually form, if I take the convex hull, what must happen is that the mu0 has to lie inside that convex hull. Because those are all possible values that I can realize by some fake data distribution. But there exists no fake data whatsoever that will give me a mu0 of 2. No sequence of heads and tails will ever produce mu0 equals 2. And the horrible thing that would happen is if we were to plug mu0 equals 2 in there, is that in many cases, our optimization problem may simply diverge, right? So the optimization problem will not have a solution because there simply doesn't exist a, binary distribution of 0 and 1s that will produce that mu0. And if you give M0, too high a weight in terms of, prior, then, well, you're screwed. Are there any questions? I think somebody raised his hand, all right? No? Okay. Let's extend that a little bit. Let's say we have, 3 outcomes. And let's say phi of 0 is here, phi of 1 is there, and phi of 2 is there. So can somebody suggest what the set needs to be in which mu0 must lie? Can you speak up?
Inside the triangle.
Exactly, inside the triangle. You're perfectly right. So what we are doing here is we are building what's called a marginal polytope. So in general, if you have some phi of x's, it's the convex hull of these guys here, for which mu0 needs to be an element of. And you can see that immediately because, well, any distribution has to be a distribution on those x's, right? And so therefore, this will give us a linear combination of, the phi of x's, and therefore it has to be inside the convex hull. Because that's exactly how you construct a convex hull. Okay. And another important example, if we have a Gaussian, you could never have negative variance. Basically, your optimization code will blow up and more horrible things than that will happen. So never have Gaussians with negative variances. And in this case, the, marginal polytope is not going to be such a simple thing anymore, but it's going to be a cone. So there's no upper bound on the variance that I could have, but I know that it's never going to be negative. And it's a convex cone because, I can scale things, and also if I cut it anywhere, it's a convex set. So if you like semi-definite programming, you will encounter that kind of stuff a lot. If you don't, then you might be lucky enough not to encounter it. So let's do that, right? So here are Gaussians. So we know how to estimate the mean and variance of a Gaussian. Right? Easy. It's just expected value of x, and and sigma squared is just the expected value of x squared minus the expected value of x squared. Right? And so our maximum likelihood estimates, we all know how to do those. Right. Now, if we have a conjugate for a Gaussian, this thing is, by the way, called the Gauss-Wishart prior. And it takes on a particularly nasty form in d dimensions. And you're going to have fun with a simple one-dimensional version thereof in the assignment. So this is such that you practice once rewriting and computing things. So here's what happens, right? We know that phi of x is x, and let's say 1/2 x transpose. And so for that, we know that mu 0 has to satisfy the property, let's just call this the first coordinate and this is the second coordinate, that mu 0, 2, so this is the second part, has to be greater or equal, so 2 times that, has to be greater or equal than mu 0, 1, mu 0, 1 transpose. This follows directly from the way how we wrote out sigma squared, right? Because we need to ensure that our variance can never get negative, and that also has to be satisfied for mu 0. Now, in the map estimate here, I made my life a little bit easy. I made my life easy insofar as I said, well, the first coordinate of mu 0, so basically the mean is going to be 0, and furthermore I assumed that mu 0, 2, so basically the covariance estimate, is going to be 1. And so all we get is now we just don't take the average over those xi points, but we shrink it a little bit towards 0. So rather than dividing by n, we divide by n plus n0. Yes, and n and m are identical on my slides. And furthermore, for sigma squared, well, we have exactly the same quantity here as before, except that we first need to compute the expectation over x squared, and then we subtract the mean. So it's exactly what we had in the line above, right? And yeah, that gives us the map estimate. So for instance, if you have high dimensional covariance estimation, this is going to smooth things such that your eigenvalues will never be 0, which is convenient if you ever need to take the inverse of a matrix. Any questions about that so far? So this is Laplace smoothing for matrices. One thing that you can see immediately is that as n gets larger, that smoothing term gets smaller, right? Any questions? Because it's eerily quiet today. Cool, thanks.
So these conjugate priors have the interpretation that they're basically adding fake observations.
Correct.
And generally, I assume with the Gaussian, when you place a prior, it's going to be like mean 0 and some covariance.
Yes.
So what's the interpretation of the fake observations in this case?
So that this is, in a way, a Hail Mary pass if you have absolutely no idea what kind of data to expect, while saying, well, since I have absolutely no idea what I'm measuring, it's going to be, well, I mean, for lack of better knowledge, I mean, it's going to be have 0 mean and it's going to have unit variance. It's a very, very poorly engineered prior. So, for instance, back to the case of measuring the voltage, well, I would probably pick something like mean being 110 volts, or I think by now it's 120, and I would probably pick something like a variance of, I don't know, maybe it's going to fluctuate by 5 volts. So I would use something like sigma equals 5. And therefore then x squared would be, well, as you can easily work out, right? So you basically get that x squared would be 120 squared plus and then 5 squared. That would be then a reasonable estimate for the second coordinate. Because the second coordinate is not really the variance that you're storing, it's the second order moment that you can then use to get the variance. Right. Yep.
I don't understand why the matrix is more likely to be invertible after doing this.
Well, if you have a matrix that has eigenvalues greater or equal than 0, right? Which is what you have to have anyway if you're taking, if you take a covariance matrix, an empirical covariance matrix, or an outer product, so M transposed, will always have eigenvalues greater or equal than 0, right? Now, if I add something to the main diagonal, then, well, the eigenvalues can only go up, right? So therefore, even if the matrix was not invertible before, after adding a little bit to the main diagonal, well, it will become invertible. It's not the same matrix as before, but you have a matrix that looks very similar and actually is invertible. Okay? Yep?
Where did the 1 come from over there?
The 1? That's the identity matrix. So, yeah, because I mean, I'm assuming that I basically have, in this case, unit variance and zero mean as my prior. And the variance of 1 is 1, right? That's where the 1 comes from.
Will there to be the equality quantity?
So in this case, it's just, so I've just written it out only for scalars, but you can vectorize the entire expression. And I'm simply, my prior fake data is that I've seen some additional data drawn from a normal distribution with zero mean and unit variance. And that's why I get the 1. If I had zero mean and variance 3, well, I would get a 9 there. If I had vectorial data and I had some covariance matrix, I'd be plugging that covariance matrix in there. As long as I have zero mean. If I don't have zero mean, then I need to correct for that offset. But we've seen that already above, right? Because the covariance is obviously, so sigma is, as we know, the expectation of x transposed minus the expectation of x times the expectation of x transposed. So therefore, if we move this over here to the left-hand side, right, you can see that in order to get a good estimate for this, I need to add the variance and the mean transposed. Okay. So we're almost done with exponential families. There's one more thing, and then I'll show you a few examples. It's called collapsing. And collapsing sounds complicated, but it's a really super useful technique. There were a couple of nice papers that have been written using this trick. It's actually a very old trick, and it makes your life really easy. So if you think about it, what's the ultimate goal for, estimating all those parameters, right? I mean, quite often you don't just go out and, want to estimate, the voltage in a socket. You want to use this, for instance, to determine, if you, plug a voltmeter into a new socket, well, is the voltage really out of range? And in this case, what you effectively do is a two-step procedure. You take your fake data, the real data, you crank the handle and get some estimates for mean and variance. And then you plug those values in and apply to find out whether some new observations have the right mean and variance. Right? So you can do that. But you're sort of missing out on something because you've actually gone for the mode of the distribution, and then after you've gone for the mode, which may or may not be a reasonable thing, well, you need to actually deploy that. Now, what you can do in many cases is you can actually integrate out that parameter, right? So you can integrate out that parameter theta. Just, I might just want to find out, given all that data, is that new observation reasonable or not? And you can do that. That's one of the really nice things about exponential families. So, we have p of x parameterized by theta times p of theta given all the previous data, and I need to integrate out the theta in order to get p of little x given capital X. But by Bayes' rule, I can just, write it all out, right? So it's essentially the joint probability of little x, all the past observations, and my fake data. I'm throwing them all into one bag, compute one joint sufficient statistic, and then, just try to find out how likely that is. Now, this gives you a very nice formula. Because we already know that this function h of m0 mu0 and m0, this was the normalization for the conjugate prior, was the integral d theta of e to the m0 mu0 dot theta minus m0 g of theta. Right? This is what we did on Monday. Does everybody remember that formula? Sort of, right? Because what we had, of course, was that p of theta given m0 mu0 and m0 was proportional to e to the m0 mu0 dot theta minus m0 g of theta. Remember, that's how we designed our conjugate prior. And this was just a normalization. Now what that means is that I have the very same integral here to solve again. Except that rather than m0 mu0, I now have the real data, the fake data, and that new extra observation plugged in. So what that means is that p of little x given capital X is e to that function h now of m0 mu0 plus m times mu of x. This is just my empirical mean, plus phi of x, and I have here m0 plus m plus 1. Now, you may want to double check that at home. And the nice thing is that if you plug actually this in for a number of different distributions, you get very nice and simple expressions out of it. So the good thing is that people have already solved that integral for you. Now all you have to do is just read off those numbers and you're done. So this way you can very quickly in closed form exactly evaluate how likely an additional observation is. There's a nice paper by Hella and Garamani called Bayesian sets, which uses this to find set extensions. So the idea is if you have something like apple, orange, pear, grape, well, it's probably a good idea to extend it with strawberry and so on, right? Or if you have Die Hard 1, Die Hard 2, then, well, okay, you might get Rambo and, you know, lots of other action movies, or maybe want to differentiate further. And they actually use that for keyword set extensions on the internet. And they got really good performance. So the idea there was, you know, you have some smoother, which is very gentle. You have a bunch of observations for which you have attributes. And then you just try to add those attributes which fit into this best. So if you'd known this equation 3-4 years ago, you could have written a very well-cited paper. If you'd known this equation 8 years ago, you could have written a blockbuster paper, namely a collapsed Gibbs sampler for latent Dirichlet allocation. But that's really the entire idea in the paper. And it's kind of embarrassing that nobody else thought about it before. Okay, so let's actually look at what this looks like in practice. So we have a discrete distribution. You know, I have, you know, outcomes between 1 and 6. I'm tossing a dice. And I get some counts, you know. The 1 comes up 3 times, the 2 6 times, and so on and so on. So the maximum likelihood estimate in this case would just, you know, take the empirical averages. So if I have, you know, 20 counts in total, if you look at the 4, well, okay, that just gets a probability of 5%. Now that feels a little bit wrong. And if you look at different, you know, Laplace smoothers in this case, namely one where you give each count, where you bump up each count by 1, and another one where you bump up each count by, you know, 100 over 6, so 16.6666 whatever, then, you know, you'll see that in the latter case the probabilities are much closer to reality. Now, good rule of thumb, you might want to have at least about 10 data points per parameter. There are better rules than that, and if you think back at the VC dimension, right? We had that the VC dimension of n linearly independent basis functions is n, and we knew that our sample size had to be at least some constant times that VC dimension. It's exactly the same effect here coming in again. So we're going to conclude this with one table that is important for you to remember where that table is. I'm not expecting you to recall all those numbers and the formulas in the table, but this is a lookup table for you to make your life easy. Because I very much doubt that you would want to rederive that each and every time again. So, just to conclude, here's the example of the honest dice and the map estimate again. And so this is basically, if you get more and more observations, you can see that, well, if I have a dice that is really, coming up with 1/6 overall, smoothing with a prior that assumes that the answer is 1/6 works really well. If I have a different dice, namely one that, is tainted, that, well, as you can clearly see, there's something wrong. The 2s and 3s are underrepresented and the 6 is overrepresented. It'll take me longer to pick up on that. So, in other words, prior comes with a cost. And the cost is that if you get it wrong, it may take you longer to actually detect what's really happening. But that's just like, if you trust me and I screw you in gambling, then, well, it might take you longer to find out that I'm actually cheating, rather than if you are very suspicious and paranoid to begin with. So this is really an engineering choice. So there was a question? Well, I just used the uniform. I used the uniform prior. So the honest prior in this case, well, would have been a uniform prior. So I assumed that all 6 outcomes are equally likely. I forgot exactly what the concentration parameter, basically what M0 was, but it would have been probably something like 10 or 20, which means it takes a fair number of observations where something rather strange is happening before I pick up on that and raise the alarm. So this is to some extent where engineering skills have to come in. Okay. So to just conclude all of that, this is really the one equation I want you to remember. When in empirical averages we had just, the empirical average. Here we take the average and we smooth it. And if you do that, you will actually get an estimator that is not too bad. You can sometimes do much more clever things if you have information about structure and so on, but that's about it. Okay. Any questions so far? Yep.
The project thing, there is, when you don't know anything about the distribution, you just pick always uniform because you want to play safe, or there is some distributions that are better than, when you don't know anything.
Okay. So, yes, there are priors that are particularly useful if you don't know anything. There's one statistician in particular who came up with a lot of different strategies for dealing with that. His name is Jeffries. There's actually a prior named after him. Those priors are a little bit less fun to deal with than simple conjugates. What I would probably do is I would just take, center of mass of the marginal polytope. But basically, if you're ever given an engineering problem where you have absolutely no idea of the answer, you should go back to the people who gave you the problem and ask them, what do you expect to happen? So don't take a I don't know for an answer. So if you ever do an internship in industry or get a job in industry or work with any team that works with real data, ask them as much as you can about the data that they have. and then build a model. Otherwise, you will not be any better than whatever they would have already hacked together as heuristic. But that was a good question. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Now let's look at mice. No, not quite, but this is Mr. Shannon. And yeah, he had some mechanical mice running around in the labyrinth, and this was, yeah, way ahead. So, we'll do information theory only very, very, very briefly. And there's going to be exactly 2 proofs in there. And I mean, it's a shame because it's a really fun subject, but we don't have enough time. The main reason why we need information theory for the purpose of this class is because we'll need to know that the entropy is always greater or equal than 0, and furthermore that the Kullback-Leibler divergence is non-negative. So, if that's all, if you already know all of that, you can pretty much relax. But it's useful to know anyway a little bit more about the entropy. So you can think of it as the number of bits that you need to encode data from a source, and we'll actually prove this. And so it's defined for a discrete distribution as the sum over x, p of x, log p of x. For density, you can extend this. Unfortunately, there it's not quite the number of bits anymore.
And it might be negative too.
Yes. That's true. But for discrete distributions, you're lucky. Who of you has gotten annoyed at some point when somebody sent you a couple of photos and he put them maybe even into a Word document and then he zipped it? I've gotten annoyed many times about that. Who ever tried running zip or gzip on JPEGs and noticed that they don't actually change in size? Okay, most of you, right? So, does anybody have an idea why that is the case?
Because they're already
They're already compressed, exactly. So, JPEGs are already compressed, and one of the last stages in that compression is an entropy coder. So this is really, swishing down the bit sequence. And, well, today we're going to look at a very primitive entropy coder in a way. So, one of the useful things about the entropy is it's concave, right? So if you have basically, the entropy can only go up if you mix 2 distributions. And, well, this is very straightforward because what you do is you just use that p log p is a convex function. And so therefore then the instance inequality holds, and so we can just take expectations and everything works out fine. So the so I should be convexity. Okay, so now the one thing that I'm going to prove is that the number of bits to encode the data from a source is actually bounded from below by the entropy. So what we need for that is a really useful inequality. It's called the Kraft inequality. So for that we need a few things. The first thing that we need is to define what's called a prefix code. Prefix code is basically, so if I have a bunch of symbols, let's enumerate them from 1 up to n. I could just encode them in binary, and that would be a code. And if all of those symbols have the same length, then I can have then basically I don't need to worry about one symbol being the prefix of another one because they all have the same length. So this cannot happen. But that's not very smart. For instance, if I have ASCII characters and the letter E is a lot more frequent than other ones, then it's kind of a shame to waste as many bits on E as you would on anything else. Or for instance, you take the Morse code, right? There, no symbol would be a prefix of another code. It's not very optimally designed, but it's a prefix code nonetheless. So maybe 1 is most frequent, and I might encode it with something like 0, 1. 2 is less frequent. Okay, maybe I can encode it with 0, 0. Okay, now if I have 3, does anybody know what the first bit has to be? It has to be 1. Okay. Now, okay, I can pick something, right? Let's say we pick a 0 here. Now we go to 4. What's the first bit? 1. Okay. What's the second bit? 1. Do I need a third bit? Well, if 4 is less than n, so if there's a 5, do I need a third bit? Yes, exactly. So I could, for instance, pick a 0 and then it goes on. So what you can clearly see is a prefix code has to be in such a way that you can't run out of bits until you've actually, fully identified that symbol. So in other words, I cannot have something like c of x equals c of x prime plus any other string. This must never happen. Yep.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't 3 a prefix of 4?
In this no, because it would start with, so it's 1, 0, and here it's 1, 1. Right. It would be a suffix of 4. So really horrible things can happen if you lose a single bit, right? Because then everything gets shifted. Do you guys know a biological system where this can happen? DNA encoding. Because when you encode from the codons to the amino acids, you use 4 valued symbols, namely, basically, A, C, T, and G. And you map 3 of those, which would encode 64 possible outcomes, into 20 possible amino acids for, getting your protein. And now if you lose one of the amino acids, really horrible things happen because now everything gets wrongly aliased. This, by the way, is not a prefix code, as you can see. It's a code of length 3 each, and that's just because the decoder, in this case the biological system that's running in our cells, cannot deal with variable length codes. But computers can do that. But there also aliasing is a really bad idea. So you may want to have error correction in it somewhere, but we don't worry about error correction here. Anyway, so let's assume I have some prefix code. And so the Kraft inequality says that if and only if I have a prefix code, so basically if I have a prefix code, then the sum over all the symbols, all over the x's, 2 to the minus length of the code for the symbol has to be less equal than 1. Furthermore, if I can find some length assignment which satisfies this, then I can find a prefix code. Okay, that's a pretty strong statement. Because I can basically first go and, decide upon the lengths. And once I have those lengths, I can construct a suitable prefix code for that. Okay, and we're actually going to construct one now. So first of all, let's assume that I have a prefix code. Okay, so we need to prove that in this case the inequality holds. So what I can do is I can just, take a random bit generator, and I have it generate a random bit sequence. And that generator will stop either, when I'm out of, when it's way longer than anything that's in my prefix code book. Okay, fine. In that case, it fails. Or it succeeds if by generating that random bit sequence, at some point, it hits a code word, right? Now, I can look at that probability of hitting a code word. That probability clearly has to be less equal than 1, because it's a probability. Now, the probability of hitting a code word is the sum over the probabilities of hitting a specific code word. Because if I hit one, then I know I can never have, could have never hit the other one. It's a prefix. Now the probability that I hit a specific code word is 2 to the minus, so the typo, L of x. And that's exactly the Kraft inequality. So what we showed by this very simple construction, right, is that whenever I have a prefix code, it has to satisfy this inequality. So let's go through the proof again, because it's a bit subtle. So I basically generate a random bit sequence. And I terminate when I encounter, when this random bit sequence has generated a code from my codebook. So, for instance, if I were to do something like, 0, 1, okay, boom, I'm here. I could do something like 1, 1, 1, and if 1, 1, 1 doesn't ever occur, and nothing below that, okay, I will not encounter a code word. So 1, 1, 1, and then something else would here fail. And well, we can actually work out, whether this, would satisfy Kraft's inequality, right? So we have 2 to the minus 2 plus 2 to the minus 2 plus 2 to the minus 2 plus 2 to the minus 3. Right? Well, 2 to the minus 2 is a quarter, a quarter, a quarter, so it's 3 quarters plus 1/8. Well, that's fine, because this equals 7/8. So the world is okay. Now, to show that actually, if I have such a length distribution, I can generate a prefix code, let's do the following thing. Let's just line up all the symbols from the shortest to the longest code word. And then I basically take the first symbol and I give it a code word of length L of x. Now, what happens at this point is, well, okay, so I basically need to exclude one thing, namely that no such code word is available anymore. So initially, we have a probability mass of 1 that we can, distribute out. So this is one on the right-hand side. Then, of course, I can find a code word for any length. So I subtract from that. So now we have that inequality and it still holds. And we know that each individual summand must be less equal than the right-hand side, so I can always find such a term. Now, as I go down further, you could say, well, hey, my fragments aren't small enough anymore, but again, the fragments are large enough in the beginning, because, there will be a contiguous chunk of 1/2 or 1/4 or whatever. And as I move down, those fragments can only get smaller that I will end up requesting. So I don't ever have to defrag or anything. And so therefore, I will end up with a proper prefix code. So, once you have the Kraft inequality, proving the coding theorem is really straightforward. But that was a slightly subtle proof, but I hope you sort of kind of got the idea. Okay. Because what I'm now going to do is I'm going to say, well, let's generate the prefix code. So let's assume I have this probability distribution. And I'm going to just take the log of the probability of a particular symbol and take the next largest integer. So we're going to have some rounding error. And we know by Kraft theorem, by the Kraft inequality, that I can construct a code for this. This is not the optimal code, but it's within 1 bit of the optimal one. Okay. Now, how do we make that 1 go away? Well, what I could do is I could take pairs of symbols. And now I define basically my new alphabet to be pairs of symbols. So if before that I had A, B, C, D, E, my new set of observations that I want to encode is AA, AB, AC, BA, BB, BC, and so on and so on. Right? Now, these symbols are twice as long, and I could again try to encode them according to what I just described. And now for those symbols that are twice as long, I make 1 bit mistake at most. Now since they are twice as long, on average, for the first and the second symbol, I only make half a bit mistake. Likewise, I can construct a sequence that's k bit, that's k symbols long. I encode that, and so the excess encoding will be 1 over k. So what this shows you is that if I design an infinitely long code, I will be able to encode perfectly. So this shows you that in the limit, the Shannon rate is actually achievable. Now, it doesn't explicitly, it's not a particularly useful algorithm, and that's why people came up with very clever techniques which do not require that you take sequences of infinite length. And this would be really a really fun information theory class that you should be taking at some point, but I can't teach you that here. Now, one thing that we need to do is we need to prove that you cannot do any better than that. And you could prove it directly here, or you could prove it by using the Kullback-Leibler divergence. And I'm going to show that you cannot find a better code by proving that the Kullback-Leibler divergence is non-negative. Let's look at that in a bit more detail. So if you ever need to remember the Kullback-Leibler divergence, because I always also get the signs wrong, and okay, we'll find out whether I got them right this time, you can think of it as the excess number of bits that you need to invest if you encode something with the wrong code relative to the correct code. So let's just write it out. So the KL divergence between P and Q is, in our case, the integral dP of x log P of x over Q of x. So this is nothing else than the integral dP of x of, this looks really crazy if I'm doing this, but minus log Q of x minus the integral dP of x minus log P of x. We know that this here is the entropy of P. Right? So, in showing that this quantity can never be less than 0, for any Q, I immediately get the result that you cannot beat the Shannon rate. Because otherwise I could simply go and use Q of x, or actually rather minus log Q of x, to suggest another code. And since I know that this would satisfy the Kraft inequality, I could design a prefix code, and I would be on my merry ways to actually, encode everything with Q rather than P. And if this were negative, I could therefore, break the Shannon limit. So if we therefore can show that this is greater or equal than 0 for all Q, we've also proven that, you can't beat what's in the entropy. Any questions about that? I mean, this is slightly indirect involved reasoning, but I just want to minimize the number of proofs that we go through. Okay. The only thing you'll need to remember of all of this is really just the non-negativity of the KL divergence, because we'll need that for variational calculus. Okay, so first of all, you can immediately check that if I plug P equals Q in there, the KL divergence is 0. Right? Because the log of 1 is 0, and so the expected value of 0 is still 0. That's easy. Secondly, well, you can immediately see that this entire thing is convex in Q. Okay, so since it's convex in Q, I can now just perform minimization over Q. So I do the following thing. I minimize over Q of D of P and Q. Of course, under the constraint that the integral dq of x equals 1, and furthermore that q of x has to be greater or equal than 0, because it has to be a probability distribution. So now constraint optimization comes again. So we write out the Lagrange function in q and lambda, which is our Lagrange multiplier, which is just d of p and q plus lambda times the integral dq of x minus 1. We skip this part of q being greater or equal than 0 because we know if it were negative then the log would already blow up. So we know that this automatically ensures that we cannot have negative probabilities. So this is a useful trick when you have an optimization problem and one of the constraints is automatically satisfied in the objective function. Don't bother adding that constraint into the problem, you'll just end up writing more. Good. So now, if we have that, all we need to do is take derivatives with respect to q. Okay. So dq of L is the integral dp of x times, now minus log q of x, right? That's what we have. We just have, you know, minus 1 over q of x. So we get dq of x. And then we have, in addition to that, plus lambda times, well, integral dq, so this is basically lambda times the integral 1. And this has to vanish for q. And so what you get is basically, it has to vanish pointwise for all x. So we have dx of, now here, minus dp of x, dq of x, plus lambda. This has to be 0, so this therefore has to be 0. Because these numbers can never be negative, so. And then, it follows therefore that dp of x, dq of x has to be constant. And now the only way to satisfy that is if p equals q, right? That's what we have down on the lower right hand side. And we're done. Okay. So this just proves that, well, the first part was to prove that for p equals q, the KL divergence vanishes. And then secondly, I proved that for p equals q, this is where the minimum is. And since I have a function that is 0 at its minimum, I know that it has to be greater or equal than 0 everywhere else. And then, again, by using that reasoning, we immediately have that I cannot beat the, the Shannon rate. So, slightly involved reasoning, but this was just done to minimize the number of proofs that we need to go through. Okay. I know this was a little bit tough right now. Any questions? Okay. You don't really need to remember this proof all the time. You just need to remember that d is greater or equal than 0. Here's a useful quantity. It's called a mutual information. And this is basically a measure for, how dependent or independent random variables are. And so this, you can get that, for instance, from saying, well, if the random variables x and y were independent, then p of x and y would be p of x times p of y. So now all I have to do is just, compute the KL divergence between the joint and the product of the marginals, and I'm done. And that's basically what the mutual information does. That's also, in a way, the number of bits that you're saving by coding up x and y jointly, as opposed to coding it up independently. Okay. Then you can also define things like conditional entropies, which you will need for the assignment. So that's basically extra bits in x given y, relative to already knowing y. And then you can immediately check that the mutual information is exactly the entropy minus the conditional entropy, and we can derive that. So these are just useful tools that, you should know. There's on the links below, there's a rather nice introduction to information theory class. Yep.
Could you repeat again about extra bits in x given y? So I'm understanding it as how many bits would you need to encode x if somebody handed you a copy of y and
Correct.
then you had to encode x for them?
That is perfect.
Okay.
This is exactly, this is, couldn't have said it any better than that. That's exactly what you would do, yes. So it's basically, let's say I already hand you the assignment, how much extra information will you need to invest in handing me the answers back? Relative to, well, me expecting you to fantasize answers for an assignment that you have no idea what it is, right? And so you can immediately see that if I hand you the questions first, your job of handing me the answers, the solutions for the assignment is going to be way easier, right? Yep.
What if you switched order
Then, so the mutual information between x and y is the same as the mutual information between y and x, right? But if I switch the order between those, I will get another quantity that doesn't really lend itself as nicely to certain optimizations. So that's why people typically write it out this way. Because you have convexity in one argument and not in the other. So remember, the KL divergence between P and Q had convexity in Q, but it's not convex in P, it's concave in P. Right. So, the KL divergence is not symmetric, and it's convex in one term, concave in the other. And you have, when you set up some of those problems, usually a little bit of freedom what you put where, but once you've done this and you've picked them wrong, you get very horrible algorithms out of it. This is the simple mechanistical explanation of why you do it this way. Yeah. Any more questions? Let me quickly prove that entropy decomposition for you. So what we have is we have h of x is the integral dp of x minus log p of x. We have that the mutual information, sorry, the conditional entropy x given y is the integral dp of y times the integral dp of x given y times, and here we have minus log p of x given y. Now obviously I can pull those two integrals together, and so I get that this is the integral dp of x and y times minus log of p of x given y. Right? Now, if I have this quantity here and subtract from that, subtract it from h of x, well, actually, let's start with the mutual information directly. So this is the integral dp of x and y of, well, we have the, let's just flip back because I also always forget it, right? And we have both terms here, p of x and y joined first and second. So we have the log of p of x and y minus the log of p of x minus the log of q of x. That's the mutual information, right? Now, we can clearly see that p of x and y equals p of x given y times p of y. So p of x and actually p of y. Okay, so therefore, the log of p of x and y is nothing else but the log of p of x given y plus the log of p of y. Okay. Now plugging this in here will give us that this is the integral d p of y dp of x given y times, and now here we have now the log of p of x given y plus the log of p of y, but that cancels out, minus the log of p of x. Okay. Now if you squint hard, you can see that this first term here is exactly this one over there, right? That's the conditional entropy. So I get that this is h of x given y, well actually minus that, and I get then in addition to that minus the integral dp of x and y times log p of x. Okay. Now, since this is an integral in x and y, but the second term doesn't depend on y, I can just integrate out y directly. And at that point, we're home, right? Because this is nothing else than the entropy of x. And so now we've proven that mutual information decomposition. So I between x and y is h of x minus h of x given y. Okay. Now, really do that. At some point, you'll enjoy it for the rest of your life. Good. So this brings us to the end of the exponential families part. I very briefly want to touch upon graphical models, just because otherwise we'll be a little bit behind. So it's going to be a little bit more applied again. So we have 5 minutes, right? Okay, 4 minutes by now. But we started a bit late, so here's something to think about. So let's say you want to go to college, and well, you'll make it through college a lot better if you either have brain or brawn, right? Because if you play football, apparently you can get a degree here, but it also helps if you're smart. And let's assume that it helps you as much if you're smart or brawny. And if you're both, then it's a little bit better. But even if you have no particular skills, there's still a 0.1 chance of actually making it. And let's say, well, smart people are less easy to find than, brawny people. So P of brain is 0.1, P of brawn is 0.2. Okay? So now let's see what we can do with that simple thing, right? This is a directed graphical model now. Namely, whether you graduate based on any of those two attributes. So here are the joint probabilities. So this is just, what's the probability that somebody has no skills? It's 0.72. Chances that he's at least smart is 0.8. Chances that he's, strong are 0.18. And chances that he has both abilities are 2%. Right. Okay, so now we have these as, the probabilities of, people occurring. Now, the probability that somebody will graduate is given by the matrix on the right. So now if I want to find out what the joint probability is over all three events, namely that somebody graduates and all the other two parts, what do I need to do with those two matrices? Any suggestion? Right. The right matrix gives us P of G given B and S. The left one gives us the joint distribution over P and S and B. How do I get P of G, S, and B? Right, it's already written down there. So what do I need to do with the two matrices? Do I need to multiply them? Do I need to add them? Or do I need to do something else really weird with them? Suggestion is it's something else really weird, but what is it? Perfect. It's pointwise multiplication of those two matrices. So it's basically dot star in MATLAB. Okay. That's what you get. So now these are just the probabilities that people will graduate and they will have those attributes. Now let's condition on the fact that somebody actually graduated. Basically look around, look among your friends, or look around campus. Let's assume that everybody who comes in here will at some point also graduate. So we need to renormalize that to 1. So we sum over all those 4 entries in this matrix. We get some number and we divide by that. Okay, so we get this. And that now gives us the probabilities for somebody who actually graduated, that he has no particular skills, that he's smart, that he's strong, or that he's both. Same numbers as what we had here before, just summed up. Mind you, this is base rule, right? No. Yeah, this is just the sort of normalization, right? So we need to sum over all those cases. There's a code for it. So now you can start asking interesting questions, right? Remember, P of brain was 10%, P of sports was 20%. So you can now, try to find out, what are the chances somebody who graduated, from college is smart. So how do we do that? How can I read that off from this table on the left-hand side? Any suggestions? I need to sum, but which numbers do I need to sum up? There are 4 numbers. So I need to sum up the 2 numbers on the right column. So I need to sum up 0.215 and 0.060. I need to sum over the guys who are just smart and wimpy, and the guys who are smart and brawny, right? The latter are much, or girls. The latter are of course less frequent, but if I sum those 2 numbers up, I get 0.275. Now for sports, I need to do the same thing, and it's just, well, which numbers do I need to sum up? Hey, come on, it's bottom row. Good. Now, okay, so what we already see is that if somebody graduates from college, he is much more likely to be either smart or strong. Now let's do something really interesting, namely let's assume that I know that he's strong, he's sporty, and he graduated. What are the chances that he's smart? Well, actually something really horrible happens here, right? Because chances are now almost back to baseline. So something really weird is happening, right? Because initially you would not think that, you know, those two abilities would really depend on each other, but now all of a sudden, by conditioning on one thing, the other probability goes down. So they actually become dependent on each other. Likewise, if I know that, well, he's in college and he's not very strong, well, okay, there's a probably higher chance that he would have gotten in because he was smart. So you can see that probability goes up. Likewise for sports. Now, these numbers you get obviously by just, you know, conditioning on the corresponding row and column. So, what's been happening here is essentially what's called explaining away. So you start with, basically you started with two independent random variables. You then observe a joint outcome of those two independent random variables. And then by observing this outcome, all of a sudden the two independent random variables become dependent. Okay. Now, we are going to investigate that a lot more on Monday. And then we'll look at things like, well, suppose that university actually makes you smart and strong. Okay. So, if you have questions, come to the office hours next Tuesday, or talk to the TAs, for instance, for assignment grading and so on. Okay. Do you mind pushing the stop button on the camera? Stop. Yeah.